Hello. You know, when I get around to writing my big book, the big Tractatus, or my Republic, my Critique of Pure Reason, or whatever it'll be, years down the line, in developing this school of thought, there's going to be a huge section in that book, a huge, gigantic section, about moral epistemology, about the epistemology of ethical claims, because so much, like, I have a very unique way of looking at all of these ethical issues that I think most people don't, and I mean, we'll see about this, but these are the things that need to sort of get ironed out, straightened away, removed, dealt with, because so much of the framing of the argument is different between the different parties before we even get to looking at the actual issues and the evidence. So much of the structure with how the debate ensues. For example, I find it that some people conflate means with ends. It's an interesting story, actually. A few months ago, or weeks or whatever, I was changing the name of the channel, and a viewer said that I asked people, what should I change the name of the channel to? And somebody said, well, you should change the name to to ends over means, because you're a consequentialist. That's what someone said. And I found that very entertaining. I didn't change my name to that because to me that sounded like too dictatorial, connotatively, at least to me. So I didn't want to change my name to that. But in a way, the guy actually had a very good point, that I do look at the ends as more important than the means. I also, in a way, the ends are more important than the means because the ends are completely ignored or conflated with the means within colloquial discussion. In the very least, they're sort of attached to one another, and there doesn't seem to be any attempt at separating them. Like, some people might make the argument, well, X should not work because X doesn't work, or because X can't work. You know, X ought not be done or attempted because it can't work. On that face, that might sound perfectly fine, but this statement ignores a crucial aspect of ends and means, is that really what it does is it conflates the ends and the means. And here's how. You know, whether or not something should or should not work is in some sense independent of whether or not it can or cannot work. Whether something can or cannot work is a simple descriptive statement, or rather, it's a question of means at that point. Can something work? Well, if it can, then let's make it work. If it can't, then it's not. But should or should not something work is an entirely different question. It is a deeper question. It's a question that asks us to, you know, it's a question that should ask us to ignore whatever evidence we have and look at, sorry, not ignore whatever evidence we have, but disregard just the surface of the evidence and look at sort of the greater pattern, the greater long-term pattern, and establish should and oughts and ethical axioms on that front, rather than trying to establish ought and ought not based on evidence that we have right now. And that's very short-term thinking. You know, and the whole point of ethical axioms, the whole point of ends is ends are about long-term thinking. They're about, I mean, ends are effectively long-term means. They're effectively means that last longer, or that are supposed to last longer than, you know, other means. And the more long-term thinking you are, the less the less you're concerned with any one piece of evidence, and the more you're concerned with, well, what is the overall pattern if you take a step back and look at, you know, all the variables interacting. What emergent property do you see? So, you know, evidence, for example, of people, you know, people learning that determinism, people learning about determinism behaving less morally. I saw a video about that recently. You know, people who learn about determinism behave more morally irresponsible. And it's like, well, that's evidence, right? Well, it's like, yeah, it is, but look at the bigger picture here, right? What is the bigger picture here? In the bigger picture, you do eventually want to get to a world where people where people are aware of determinism and are not attached to this idea of free will. You have to get to such a world because it's part of, you know, demolishing certain bad systems of ethics. So, from that sense, it's like, you know, are you necessarily looking at the bigger picture? Or even historical evidence that gives you examples of human nature and how human nature is X and therefore we must do Y and yada, 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 yada. You know, the whole point is separate the ends and the means. You know, look at the ends. You have to... You have to look at the bigger picture. Always look at the bigger picture. I think it's like, you're not ignoring all the evidence, you're just looking at the bigger picture. You know, for a simple system, it's very easy to determine what is right and what is wrong. Let's say it's two guys in a room and one kills the other. Is that right or wrong? Well, without any other context, it's obviously wrong, because this is all the context you have, and the only time interval you have is fairly short. But once you take a complex system, the ends become infinitely more complex and chaotic and nonlinear. And so now the question becomes, you know, almost unsolvable on its face. And in individual cases, the situation ends up being slightly different. You know, overall, you know, in the system as a whole, we may want nobody to end up killing anyone, but you know, in local, you know, scenarios in space-time, we may need to have somebody kill someone to prevent an even worse fate from occurring. That is what ends over means pretty much suggests, is that sort of moral rules are only true within within very specific time intervals. And if we're looking at the bigger picture, the rules evaporate and we get... specific rules evaporate and vary from case to case, and we just get a broader pattern. And it's this broader pattern that tells us what to actually do. Individual rules won't always be correct. The point is, you know, to establish a world without murder, it may not be true that to establish such a world, in the local case, we must not murder. You know, it doesn't necessarily follow. You know, the whole is not the sum of its parts. It's that whole shtick again that I keep repeating. But no, going back to moral epistemology, the purpose I have is with separating ends and means is because if you don't separate ends and means, you open yourself up to two problems, two fallacies. Number one is it allows the speaker with a hidden agenda to get by any scrutiny if they make the argument that something shouldn't work because it can't work, right? It allows someone with a hidden agenda to get by, because now you don't know... See, if I say a certain world X is impossible and therefore shouldn't work, is impossible and therefore shouldn't work, there is no way to know for someone else. There's no way for you to know whether or not it is true that X cannot work, or whether or not I want X to not work, and I'm saying X isn't going to work to advocate for my worldview, right? There's no way for you to know whether or not I have a hidden agenda without explicitly asking, demanding that I express my ends themselves. What ends do I want? Because if I'm expressing ends, then I have to look at the bigger pattern. I can't I can't defer to the authority of this evidence that is very, local evidence and very, which is local evidence and limited evidence, right? I can't, I have to avoid the fallacy, and I have to realize that the whole is not the sum of its parts. So, you avoid the problem by separating ends and means. You avoid the problem of the hidden agenda, because if you separate ends and means, the person's hidden agenda becomes non-hidden, because then they tell you what their ends are. That is their actual agenda. That is what they want, you know. And maybe they won't be honest about it, but the point is to apply the algorithm, you know, demand that they be honest about it. If they're still not honest about it, then they're just dishonest. There's no point in having a discussion. But, you know, you have to frame it in that way. Otherwise, there's always room for them to put their hidden agenda into the discussion. That's number one. Number two, the second reason is the reason that, you know, X can't work, therefore X shouldn't work. You don't know for a fact that X can't work, because nothing in reality is certain. There's a perpetual state of uncertainty, especially wherein questions of human nature are concerned. Now, the one thing that's true about human nature, the one solid truth about mankind, is that man is very malleable and flexible and stretchable. And he would have to be flexible and malleable and stretchable, else he wouldn't be able to adapt to any environment. That is the purpose of evolution, is to be able to adapt to as many environments as possible. If man is, you know, solid, then he can't adapt, and that makes him easy to destroy. If he's not flexible, then the purpose should be to make him more flexible, because that's how he's adaptable. So moral systems that rely on solid claims about human nature run into this problem, is that there's absolutely no certainty when it comes to human nature. There's absolutely no certainty when it comes to complex systems involving human nature. Not for a million reasons, but number one is that human nature itself is stretchable. Man can be stretched to fit certain parameters and criteria that we want him to. And you can't ignore that aspect of it. And if you don't ignore that aspect of it, well then you need a more complex ethical theory. Then you need to, again, separate ends from means. See, the point is, it's one thing for me to say, it's one thing for me and you to come together and say, look, we want to establish this world, the best of all possible worlds, and then to say, well, it doesn't work necessarily because of problems X, Y, and Z. Right? That's fine, because at least there we have some common ground. At least we have agreed that there are some things that we should try to establish. And we can't fully establish them because of reasons X, Y, and Z, so we get as close as we can. You know, but we have the same intentions, so it's likely that we're going to have the same, you know, we're going to have similar methodologies, and we're going to end up in a similar place. And if we don't end up getting there, it won't be because one of us was acting against the other. It won't be because one of us had a hidden agenda. It'll be because, or because one of us was a zealot or something. It'll be because we just couldn't make it. It just wasn't possible. Reality did not allow for us to get our perfect world. However, if I come in and I'm like, I want to build this perfect world, can I do this? And you come in with, this X, Y, and Z is true, therefore certain worlds are impossible, and you shouldn't even try to try and establish them. That is a tenuous theory. That is an incredibly tenuous theory, because you don't know for a fact. The universe is very uncertain. What is true and is not true varies, you know, especially when it comes to something so vague and vaporous as human nature or the nature of society. You know, things that change as soon as you realize how they work. You know, those are things you cannot make. You cannot construct your ethical theory about on solid claims about human nature and the nature of society, because there is nothing solid there. So this is not a solid theory and can be discarded automatically, right? Instead, you know, you'd have to make the same claim that I'm making, is you want the best of all possible worlds also, but it may be difficult or impossible because of X, Y, and Z. That is perfectly fine. But doing the reverse, saying that because of X, Y, Z, we needn't consider possible world A, B, or C, well then you've made the mistake. And you possibly have a hidden agenda as well. So there's two errors, and those two errors need to be avoided. right? Because the thing is, the point here is that we are actually, we are more certain, we can be more certain about the world we want to live in and the world that should exist than we are about what is true within the world we currently exist in. You know, we can be more certain about what ought to be true than we can about what actually is true about society today, right? That's why, like, this is why, like, Ayn Rand and fucking these, like, selfist apologists, all libertarians, free market, marketeers, conservatives, etc. Their whole philosophy needs to be justified by the purpose that one of two things: either the market, the way it works, creates the greatest amount of good possible, it's the best of all possible worlds, or it's the best world, or it's the best of all possible worlds, or that there is no alternative. They have to make that claim. They have to make that a claim, a collectivist claim like that, that utility is maximized, you know, with their system, or that it's not maximized, things are still, it's not perfect, things are bad, however, it can't be avoided because doing anything else would make things worse. They have to justify it on those grounds, because if they don't, they're just assholes who are, you know, spewing apologia for selfish assholes. You know, or just zealots who believe that they know how the world, who believe in solid claims about liquid, chaotic systems. So, and this proves my exact point. Now, see, one of those claims is completely nonsensical, which is the claim that, saying that there is no alternative, that's okay. Because the idea there is that you want the best world also, but we can't get it because there's no alternative. But saying that the best world is achieved, you know, that way, that is false. Because the best world is not achieved via the free market and that whole shtick. Because the best world is another world. You know, you have to make, you can only defend, you know, capitalism on the grounds that there is no better alternative, not on the grounds that there is no hypothetical better world, because you could easily imagine a world that's better, you know, world with equality and virtue and all that shit, and no greed. But if, you know, you're going to say that there is no better world can exist, that's a separate claim. You wish there was a better world. We wish that there was a better world, but it's not there. That's entirely different from saying what they usually say, which is that this is the best world, guys. The point is, the way they do it creates room for a hidden agenda, which should be avoided. And that's why I always try to find some sort of common ground with the person I'm talking to. It's like, well, what do we actually want to live in? What kind of world do we want to live in? And it's like, well, I want to live in a world like this. Okay, well, now that we agreed on that, then we can talk about whether or not it's possible. And if it's not possible because of economic theory, which I think is nonsense, but, you know, if it's not possible because of that, then we can have that talk. But at least then we're on the same page, and we're interested and invested in the same thing. Because the moral epistemology is, you know, thing. And this is the worst thing that I hate. You know, well, it's not the worst thing, but it's so annoying. People conflating ends and means. Ends and means need to be held separate, and ends need to be established before means are established. Otherwise, you're just chasing your own end, and there's no, like, if you're chasing your own end, then you're not going to agree, or you're ultimately wasting your time. There's whatever consensus you're going to have is a very limited short-term consensus because you're chasing your own end. My purpose is to establish an end that everybody can agree on, have complete consensus on that end, then look at means. And that's how you establish moral truth. And again, I don't have it all fully worked out. I don't pretend to, but my purpose with things like ends over means and trying to separate those two and looking at is-ought entanglement and is-ought equivalence and intrinsic versus extrinsic value. These videos I've been making the past few weeks, it's all in this moral epistemology area. It all has the same sort of character and structure, and it would be a huge chunk of my work that I'm eventually going to do someday. And it's a huge chunk of my own philosophy, and it's just why I differ with a lot of people on the left, I think, or with just a lot of people in general, is that I'm looking at a structure of a thing. I'm looking at sort of the biggest picture possible, the big picture, and that's something people usually don't do. And that's why we have, I suppose that's why I'm different. Anyway, make that of what you will. Cheers. Yeah, good luck. Good luck to me.